Hello and welcome to the Adapt with Danette FM podcast. We're in series 2. My name is Danette Fenton-Menzies, and in this series we are looking at problem solving and collaboration. And today I'm really excited to have a conversation with Dr Richard Hodge. Before we get there, I'm going to introduce my producer, Jez FM, who happens to be my son. Jez, how are you? Welcome.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here. It's awesome to produce this podcast with you. And also I wanted to say, this is the Adapt podcast with Danette FM. This is for people that need to learn or want to learn how to adapt. The times are changing really rapidly. So it's important to know sort of how to adapt, what's important. Technology's changing, jobs are changing. What does that all look like? Well, here is your best source of information outside of the amazing book, The Adaptable Leader by Danette FM, which also has a lot of really important tips for adapting in the sort of 2020s and beyond. Well, today we're going to be talking to Dr. Richard Hodge about solutions to problematic problems. Now, this is very interesting because there's technical problems and problematic problems, and we'll get to them in the conversation. But Danette, I think before we get into any of that, I think we've got to dive into our news segment. So
Yes.
Let's dive into that. Alrighty, this is Adapt the News. This is where we look at a news story, and Danette, you use your adapt mind to kind of look at what this is going to look like and how people can adapt to it. So this news story is relevant certainly at the time we're recording, but I assume could be even more relevant by the time this is released, which is in 2 weeks' time. So we're kind of doing a bit of foresight here, but it's all right. We'll be adapting and being adaptable to any situation that could exist. So the actual thing that I sent you, which is not exactly what I wanted to talk about, but it's sort of an overall sort of gathering of different headlines I've been seeing the last couple days, which is that we're talking about sort of a potential of a recession. So we've seen markets closing really low in some places. They've just started to pick up on the day of recording. But I guess the word recession has been thrown around a lot. Now, for me, I really would hope that the word recession is a conjunction of the words recess is in session, which would be great because I'd love a little recess to have a lunch, but it unfortunately has nothing to do with that. And as someone that is 30 right now, I haven't really been through a recession before. So I guess this may or may not happen. We don't know as yet. But I suppose I want to get your thoughts on that topic in general and what people might be able to expect.
So I've been through a few recessions. And one of the reasons we started our companies is because education tends to be something that people need whether there's a recession or there's a boom. So one of the things I'd say to people is often when we go into something like recession, our brain tends to freak out and focus on all of the negatives. Part of being an adaptable person and an adaptable leader is actually to work with your brain to open it up to the fact that there are also opportunities in recessions. And so part of it is how do we keep our possibility mind open when we are receiving lots of messages that the world out there is bad. And so one of the things I always say is, as much as possible, how do you build your brain so it focuses on possibilities rather than this is a massive problem? Because the moment we focus on this is a massive problem, our brain shuts down the neural pathways and actually gets stuck on the problem. So to be adaptable, I think we ask ourselves better questions like what's the opportunity here? What's the possibilities here? And what does this mean for me? So what's one thing I could do that could make an opportunity out of this? And it's not to say, because there are some people who are doing it really tough, but it's like, well, what could I do? And I loved in a previous segment, we talked about, making this a bit easier. I love that question about how can we make this easier to be able to deal with. And I think one of the beautiful things for me that have come out of recessions and hard times in business is it's taught me what's really important. Because a lot of people, we get caught up in the things, but actually what's most important in our lives are the people, the impact that we have. And so there is always hope because we know with recessions, it is a cycle. So there's up and downs. And sometimes I think things get cleared out in the downs that maybe weren't serving us anymore and we needed to move on. And I really like your definition there, Jez, where you talked about recess, because maybe the recession is actually a recess to the next level of who you are and what your life is about. So there's some of my thoughts. What about you?
Well, I think actually, Danette, a great way to kind of prove what you were talking about, where you're talking about how it sort of cuts away everything that's unimportant and just what's important is left, actually, is a really kind of interesting thing, because we actually got an example of that in a very surprising way in some ways with COVID recently, which is that, you have a lot of people walking around going like, I'm the most important person, all this stuff. And then when push came to shove, the most important people were people that work at a supermarket, Uber drivers, it actually became the people that often people think of as the sort of bottom rung and everything. They were actually the crucial ones, and everyone else was basically expendable, it turned out. Not expendable, but they were not as required to keep everything running day to day than actually a lot of people who we sort of pay very little money to, Yes. So in some ways that allowed us to see that actually our system requires a lot of people doing a lot of low paying jobs. That's really actually sort of the core of what keeps everything going. And then everything else is kind of sort of floating above that and is working off of that, which I thought was really kind of interesting. And so I think in some ways, maybe heading into this recession, it's a way to kind of look at our life like that. Is me spending all this money on this thing, is that actually important, or is this now, what can I do that sort of doesn't cost that much money but still builds me up, I think, in an important way.
Love that, Jez. And I reckon we do a big shout out to those frontline workers who, work tirelessly during that time and are still working tirelessly. The extraordinary gifts they've given us. Just want to say thank you.
They did a lot for us when there was no vaccines or anything. These people were out there still doing their job. So that was amazing. Yeah. Mum, I was going to say, did you want to talk a little bit before we get into today's conversation with Richard Hodge, anything that you wanted people to kind of keep an eye out for, or anything about this conversation?
I loved that he talks about the big gnarly problems, as we don't focus on it from a problem perspective because we might be solving from the wrong perspective. But he talks about looking at situations as problematic, and that allows us to expand what we're focusing on, who we talk to, and our brain. And we're taught often to try and narrow it down so we can solve it. But what if we're solving for the wrong thing? So I really loved his questions in this conversation. What about you, Jez, before we go into it?
I mean, there's just so much going on here. I'm not going to say a specific bit of info to say. I'm just going to say enjoy Dr. Richard Hodge's vibes. Yes. He really has a great energy. And so do you, Danette, in this conversation. So it's a wonderful conversation. I think let's just go to it. So here is Danette's conversation with Dr. Richard Hodge.
Hello and welcome to Adapt with Danette FM. And today I've got a special guest, Dr. Richard Hodge, and we're going to come to Richard in a second. We're going to do this podcast slightly different. We're going to extend the conversation to talk about a couple of elements in my ACCEPTS model, which is in the book, The Adaptable Leader. And ACCEPT stands for we need to be authentic as leaders, we need to be curious, we need to collaborate, we need to experiment, problem solve, transform, and also be sustainable. So we're going to talk about a couple of these elements today. And so I'd like to hand over to Dr. Richard Hodge to do a brief introduction, and then we will get on to some questions and conversations. Over to you.
Thank you, Danette. It's such a joy to be here in conversation with you today. And as ever, I'd give you a hug if we were close. So for me, oh gosh, I'm 68 years old, so I've earned the grey hair, and that's after 40 years of working in large organisations. And the last 10 years of my working life, I've been running my own practice, and that's really around helping people see that no problem's too big for them to act and leave the world better for what they've done. So, and when Danette talks about her ACCEPTS model, I really do love that, because and I almost like it in almost the reverse order, because sustainable is what we all want, right? The young people are crying out for it, and even my grandson, you know. So I have 4 grandchildren. The oldest one is 23, a signed up member of the Labour Party. But at dinner one night, he points across the table and he goes, "It's all your generation's fault." And of course, but what he doesn't realize, and what he does, but not to the degree I think that students today need to be, is just how much work has been happening in the time that I've been alive, we've been alive, in which every generation in that time has contributed to the building of complexity science and system science that really will help create the hope for our children and grandchildren that indeed no problem is too big to act, and leave the world better for what we've done. And so my next 30 years, fingers crossed, is really focused on seeking to make that accessible to as many people as possible. So the opportunity to speak with you today is just another wonderful chance to spread a little bit of the message.
I love that, Richard. And I love the next 30 years. And let's hope it's 30 or 40. Why go for less?
Eyes on 100. Yeah, that's right. Well, 30 years it'd take me to 98, so I'm nearly there.
Nice, love that. So let's start with the questions. And as I said, we're going to have a conversation. So I know you were keen, before we even perhaps get into the questions, to talk a little bit about transform. So do you want to talk about that element and share some insights there?
Well, and it does come back to, my grandson and people of, the younger generations, as well, I think, of the older generations that feel locked into a way of working and not quite sure how to get out. But the notion of transformation within your accepts model really is about driving change, but change that makes it impossible to go back, right? Impossible to go back. And so I've got dragonflies on my wall here, and they're not just there pictorially. My wife bought me those glass and wire models because much of my work is about self-realization, right? So first look in the mirror, then transformation. What is it you're going to change? And then new beginnings. And the dragonfly is a symbol for all of those things. And so I now carry that as a totem for the way I engage. And then this drawing by an Indigenous artist, a Yorta Yorta woman, is titled New Beginnings. So I just had to have, it's a print, but I just had to have a copy on the wall. And you can see how it's a journey, right? That there's no big bang, but there are centers of gathering and the ways in which we come together, and therefore, we can explore other bits of the accepts model around collaboration, etc. And I think that that's really crucial, because the thing with the dragonfly is that it spends 80% of its life as a nymph in a watery environment. And we are at risk of doing exactly that if we do not break free of the reductionist training that's been drilled into us, the deductive reasoning that's behind many of the problems that we face in the world today, that we need to take a bigger view, which really means that we've got to have the courage at some time to leave our old ways of thinking, and like a nymph, climb out onto a stick and hang on, and and allow the dragonfly to bloom and then take flight in all of its miraculous color. You know, they're really quite iridescent creatures. And so to me, that's a beautiful metaphor for the sort of shift that that we need through transformation. Yeah. So
I love that. And I'm going to encourage our listeners to actually watch the video of this, because we do both the audio and the video and we share it on our YouTube channel, just to be able to see not only what's in your background, Richard, but the beautiful way when you were describing the nymph coming out of the water, how you're actually demonstrating it with your body as well was just magnificent. So encourage listeners to actually become viewers for this podcast. So let's start with the question around, what have you seen or experienced that helps you with whether it's collaboration and or problem solving? And I really would love for you to expand a bit about problems too, because we had a great conversation last week about this, and I'm sure our listeners and viewers would love to hear this.
Well, perhaps pick up, Danette, on the point I've just made around the way in which we've been drilled, and our education systems, you know, that, and of course, if you haven't seen, any of your listeners haven't seen Sir Ken Robinson's talk on how schools kill creativity, you know, absolute must see, not only because it's one of the best ever TED Talks, but also just the message about how indeed this reductionist approach to thinking, for all of its benefits, actually squashes human capacity and potential, that we are framed, that each day we go to school and we're drilled for 7 or 8 hours, and then you pass a test, and then you go up a year, and so on all the way through, and you pass a test and you go to university, and you're squeezed down into narrower and narrower domains. And the world ain't like that. Now, for all of that, you know, I'm not saying we've got to kill reductionist thinking, no, because without which we would never have nuclear medicine, right? And that gave my brother an extra 3 years of life, which he was entirely grateful for. So, and us. So, but it's what else beyond reductionist thinking? And part of the reductionist approach is to say, well, look, break the problems down, and for each part of the problem, then find a solution. And so you aggregate, and by this, you get an accretion of parts, but actually that doesn't fit the whole problem, because it's often then, as it's broken down, allocated, different parts of the problem allocated to people. And so it's much better to think of a situation as being problematic rather than a problem, right? And it's that problematic. So and then you can say, so what's problematic about it? And invite a wider range of perspectives. And then you get into that perspectival knowing that just invites a different way of looking at the problem, and also perhaps overcomes biases that suggest, well, you know, So I had a CEO one time, you know, and his bias was earnings per share. My bias was keeping professional services people meaningfully employed, which clearly rubs up against that when people are seen as a cost, when you're looking at it from an earnings per share basis, but yet the whole idea of being, you know, people were my inventory on the shelf as far as running a professional services business go. So you end up with completely different perspectives. And it's not to say that either are wrong, but if you just take it from one perspective, you're going to break people in the process.
Which is not a great outcome at all.
No, far from it.
I've seen it many times.
As we all want meaningful work, right?
Totally. Yeah, love it. All right. Well, let's continue. So could you share an example of where you've seen perhaps poor collaboration and or problem solving and particularly interested in what were the impacts when they weren't done well.
Leadership plays a huge role. And one project I was involved in, and I won't actually name it because then people who are involved in that will know exactly who I'm talking about. And I'm going to be, complimentary to one and critical of the other. But in order to put a new governance system in place, and people who know me will know what I'm talking about anyway. But anyway, its impact could possibly influence 50,000 people within an industry, right? But its center of gravity was around an element of the defense organization, basically seaworthiness and how you put boats and maintain the maritime capability that is important in our national security. But it goes all the way across the whole of the agency, because it wasn't just one organization putting boats in the water, so many people were. It goes all the way across the life cycle from, conception to grave of every vessel and every class of vessel. So multiple classes of vessels. Some were, small boats, some are really big boats that have amphibious capability and the like. So how do you govern all of that when you're also talking about their industry support capability? You can't just look at it as a problem. It's also got to be looked at as problematic because there are so many perspectives. So the leadership to actually engage in that problem needed to be one that was had a perspective or invited multiple perspectives and an acceptance that we could be wrong, because more than likely we were, right? No one person would know everything about everything. So how do you keep perspectival knowing alive, and how, which goes to the E in your accepts, how do we experiment so that we learn our way forward? So that's one leader who actually set up the program. Now, he was posted elsewhere. Another chap comes in and he's far more rigid, grown in that reductionist mold, right? Grown in that reductionist mold, very deterministic, very much one for positional authority, as opposed to, right, very keen on promotion, that whatever came out of this was, the benefit for him could well have been promotion. It's sort of like the CEO conversation before. What was in it for him or earnings per share versus about keeping, the organization together. So it's really problematic if the leadership style doesn't match a multi-perspectival approach. And you can't drive that from positional authority.
Great example. And even goes back to that bit about the self-reflection, self-awareness bit, that sometimes particular leadership styles are not going to work in those situations. And that's a great example of a bad example. I love it.
Well, and that's just something to be wary of. But then that invites the people, and it's not to say that we didn't get the work done. We did. But then how we had to work with someone who was driven by positional authority, then changed in how did we make good ideas his idea. And well, which is fine, because our view was about getting a better governance system in place, that outcome, that's something that was sustainable for the longer term, for the whole of the organization across the life of the capabilities. And if the price of that was someone got promoted, well, all well and good.
I love that. Even that outlook, I love that. Based on your experience, what tips would you have for others? And Jeremy added this bit about including young people who might be just starting out around developing their problem solving and collaboration skills. And I'd love for you to draw out about the problematic bit too, because I reckon there's some really great insights there for our listeners.
Yeah. Well, there's a fair chance that someone will come and they will have their perspective of a problem. And they'll come, particularly to a younger person, which will, like when we were young, we started at the bottom, right? Or somewhere close to it. I was a truck driver, by the way. So yeah, I was carrying.
I pumped petrol at a service station
There
that
you go.
primarily had trucks coming through, and I cooked and I waitressed. Great start to a working career.
I think so, because it teaches you about personal relationships and how to get things done when you have no positional authority.
Totally agree.
Right. Which is crucial. So never lose. That's the first message to the young kids. What you learned at McDonald's about, interface with the clients and maintaining good customer skills is absolutely vital. So there's the first thing. But someone will come along and they'll go, righto, Hodge, I want you to do X. Here's the solution. Build me one of them. And if you're a software programmer, you might be, being asked to cut a bit of code, or if you're a mechanical engineer, they might go, no, we needed that fitted on the boiler, or what have you, right? The first question I invite you to ask, that shifts from the problem to explore the problematic, is, if that's the solution, what's the problem? They've given you a how and you're exploring the what. So if that's the solution, what's the problem? And explore that question. And tell them that you need just an understanding so that you have the right context. The thing is, when you're exploring the problem, you haven't got into the context, because then the next question I want you to ask is go, well, if that's the problem, why is it a problem? Right? And then what you're doing now, you're exploring the greater context within which that problem sits, for which your solution is going to contribute, because whatever you do will have that ripple effect back up through the objective space into the context. Then I want you to ask, well, if I do X, will it add the benefit you want into that context? So that you've asked about the how, you've asked about the what, you've asked about the why, and you've asked about the if. And then come back. Now start thinking and asking hard questions from what you've learned about the context. Why is this a problem? Say, well, look, is that problem definition really the best definition? And then I go, whoa, what do you mean? Because frequently what we learn from system science is that the first definition of a problem is frequently wrong. Right? So you could end up solving precisely the wrong problem. Then you can have a conversation around, well, if that's the problem, is this the best solution? And then you come back and maybe it's right, but at least you'll know exactly what you're doing and why you're doing it. The other thing that you've done is explore your boss's problem space and her boss's problem space, so that you've operated at one level, but your brain has gone up 2 levels. And if you do that right throughout your career, once you become the manager that owns the problems, now you're looking not only at the executive, but the senior executive. And then when you become the executive, you're not only looking at the senior executive, you're looking at the board. And so it just ripples up, and it's exactly the same questions all the way through life.
I love that. It not only sets them up at work, but also at life, to be able to think that much broader, much more strategic as well. So, love that process.
Yeah. And if there's any blokes out there, I'd take caution in how you approach those questions with your wife, right?
I'll take that one. Oh, hilarious. So
but it works, you just find the right language.
Look, that could be another podcast, Richard, I reckon. So my next question, which sort of follows on from this one, is, what's your favorite example of problem solving and collaboration, and why. I'd love for you to bring that problematic bit into it as well, just so people can explore with an actual example. And we don't have to name the organisation.
Well, I will, but it's 20 years old because I can't help, to actually make it tangible for folks. It started in 2003, which is for your younger listeners, the year they were born. But 2003, SARS landed in, so a communicable disease landed in Auckland, and the New Zealand Ministry of Health, about 18 months later, asked the question, what is the capacity and capability of the New Zealand health workforce to deal with serious and unusual emergencies? And it was a prelude, really, to the next pandemic, which, of course, was COVID. Now, they put that question out for tender. So they had asked it as a problem, and it was a workforce problem. And myself and a mate, we were working in a consulting business in Canberra, and we responded, and we were invited to interview in Wellington, and we were successful in the interview. But at the interview, we dared to suggest that actually just focusing on workforce was problematic because that's just one element of what is ultimately the whole of nation's response to a communicable disease. And their capacity for collaboration, their capacity for cooperation, their capacity for experimentation, particularly with novel agents or diseases that land. You've got, you're writing the rule book as you're responding, so you've got to learn your way forward, and you really don't know what the consequences are. So how much of all of the other agencies of government and the private agencies that perhaps run your telecommunications and so on and so forth, and your energy sources, your banks, what if all of those go down as a result, which could quite easily happen, right? You get a novel agent going into an air conditioning system and fills the headquarters of a bank, and you go, boom, 70% of staff are now off for 2 weeks, and you go, shit. So that's a real national problem. So we suggested that a better question for them to address was, what was the capacity and capability of the New Zealand health system to respond to serious and unusual emergencies? And they said, well, we'll pay you for 10 days. So they took an experiment, right? Because which was very wise. We'll give you 10 days to actually develop the methodology by which you'll now address the bigger question. And we'll run that as an experiment, because if we don't like the methodology, then you're not going any further, which was super, right? It was very, very sensible to go, well, don't just charge into problematic situations, because, as I learnt from, I'd learnt, but was reminded by a Deputy Secretary of Prime Minister and Cabinet in New Zealand, yes, we can solve one problem, but invariably it creates another problem somewhere else, reminding us of Hoare's law of large problems, that inside every large problem, there's 100 small problems bursting to get out. Right? So that's really the first thing about it is think about whether or not you've got the question right, and then experiment with the methodology. And then as we ran that, we again broke it down into an experiment. Once they were happy with the methodology, then we took a small area of the nation around Wellington, Lower Hutt, and that. And there, I think, 3 main health institutions there, Wellington Hospital and the like. And we engaged Dr. Peter Roberts, bless him, a lovely man, who was at the time head of intensive care in Wellington Hospital. So we couldn't ask for a better clinical advisor. But he'd just finished a master's degree. I don't know where he got the time, but in public policy. But he would say to us and remind us constantly that bad health policy is more dangerous to my patients than the flesh-eating bug.
Ouch.
Yeah. And you go, wow. So this intangible thing called policy making, and some people go, oh yeah, that's a bit of a doddle for those people, high up that aren't actually at the coalface. But the thing is, it's the decisions that's made there that ripple down on, well, workforce. What are the constraints you're putting on the workforce? What are the constraints you're putting on the capital acquisition? What constraints are you putting on the distribution of supply? And particularly critical supplies like ventilators and infectious control things, and so on and so forth. So, and that extends beyond health. That's a lesson for absolutely everyone. If you're in the policy business, I almost think that policy shouldn't be signed off until you've shown that it can be implemented.
I'd love that to happen. Because
wouldn't it be
then
great?
they have to consult, don't they? With way more than just one or two because often they miss out on really important stakeholders.
Yeah. So that then opened the door for collaboration on a scale that in the solving of that question that I've never experienced before or since, frankly. Les and I must have interviewed over 200 CEOs. Because you think about health and then a national response to a health emergency, and we've all just lived through it, right? Yes, and how important rubbish collection is, how important, all of these things that if they don't happen, actually create the sort of bed for disease and for our own mental health, right? And so the importance of nurses, the importance of couriers, the importance of delivery drivers, the importance of cleaners, and the whole thing just broadens the perspective beyond just the health workforce in that particular case. But that's the benefit of looking at things from a problematic perspective rather than from a problem perspective.
What a great share. What a great example. I bet people, our listeners and our viewers have gotten lots and lots of questions about that.
Yeah, mind you, if I might just add, you've got to be prepared for the time it takes to engage people, right? So now what could have been a 2-month study done with an Excel spreadsheet and a few conversations blew out to 18 months, an oversight committee chaired by the Prime Minister and Cabinet, the CEO from Auckland Health, the chief clinician out of the Ministry of Health, and so on, all coming together, as well as then briefing Treasury, because now you're looking at how you cost options that have to go to government, and a prime minister who would ask, well, if I'm spending this extra 130 million on health, where's it coming from? Does that mean I take it out of transport or education or what? Where? Do I raise taxes? What? So the risk equation changes, and that's what we learned about moving from a local study and where we tested the methodology at Wellington level. Before we went national, we realized that our risk methodology that worked locally was not strong enough to be able to go nationally. So we had to spend time building those methodologies and making sure they were robust to go up to a national level.
And great insight there too. And that whole, as it evolves up, things change, and people being able to be aware of those things such as the risk, etc.
And so we didn't know about the answers to like the risk methodology. So that in itself was an experiment, right? So that's an experiment within a problematic situation, and you're doing lots of them time and again to learn your way forward.
And I love that, because we don't always have the answer and people want that certainty. And yet the better approach is to slow down, to get more information. And you're not always going to get 100%
No.
certainty. So why the experiments help. Love that. So my next question is, and we're coming to the end of this, but is there anything else you would like to share, including any helpful resources that, given your career of 40 odd years,
Oh
I'm
gosh.
sure there are some things that you would think would be helpful for others as well.
I can't help but start with a more recent book rather than the systems book, which was where I started on my systems journey. But in Tyson Yunkaporta's book, Sand Talk, How Indigenous Thinking Can Save the World, there's a lovely piece right at the end of the book where Tyson, for those who don't know him, is an Indigenous, a First Nations person from far north Queensland, and he's a senior lecturer at and researcher at Deakin University. He runs the Indigenous knowledge system. So he's setting up a capability and collaborating with Canada as well with their Indigenous knowledge system. So, but at the end of this book, he talks and recalls a conversation that he had with one of his elders, who he refers to as Mama Doris. Now, Mama Doris is clearly older than Dr. Yunkaporta, and she's seen 50 years of white man intervention in local communities, and can say how white man typically has got it precisely wrong every single time. Because what she has observed is that we sit at our desks or away, and we might have had a few conversations, but we come up with what we think is a solution to the problem. And then we go in and direct that solution into the community. Then we find, lo and behold, it doesn't work, right? So the first word that Mama Doris uses is directing solutions, direct. And it's only when it doesn't work that we begin to reflect on what went wrong and why it didn't work. And of course, we're not going to find all the answers talking to ourselves. So then we connect with the community to find out what went wrong and why. And in that process, learn how community for the Indigenous people isn't just a group of people, because each person is connected with story, with land, with water, with air, with each other, with ancestors, with their song lines, their dream time, and that whole human experience and beyond the human consciousness is part and parcel of who they are and how they engage in community on the land with the resources available from the land, which is why indeed they then have totems themselves, so that they then maintain a responsibility to care for their totems. And only then, after connecting with people on community, does white man then leave with respect, and Mama Doris would say, often with tears, saying, well, thank you, we've learnt so much. And instead of coming in directing, reflecting, connecting, and respecting, if only we do it in precisely the other order, right? Start with respect. Connect with the community that has this problematic issue. Really understand how they are connected. Then reflect with them about and let them co-create. So facilitate that co-creation of what is needed to change. Then, if you've empowered them and resourced them, they can self-direct and actually increase respect for both communities. So it actually sets then, an infinity loop, which I embed in my frameworks in the four wings of the dragonfly, as well: why, respect; how, connect; what, reflect; and if, direct. And so if you've done all that, then you will learn your way forward. So that, I think, is one of the most valuable resources. But if people really want to get into systems thinking and all of that, where I started and where many people have started is with Professor Peter Checkland, Systems Thinking, Systems Practice. And it was Peter Checkland that first, gave me the nudge through this book to think about situations being problematic rather than a problem.
I love those resources, and we'll make sure that in the descriptions to the podcast, we'll include links to all of the resources we've been talking about today.
And one other that and it is my most marked up copy of any book I've got, because the ladies haven't rated a mention yet, but both of those men, Peter and Tyson, are still alive. Mary isn't, but she wrote a book called Creative Experience, Mary Parker Follett. She died when my father was 3. So this book was written in 1924. So, and she talks about collaboration, and the essence of collaboration is that it's about integrated diversity. Now, isn't that stunning?
What gorgeous phrasing.
Integrated diversity. And within this, because she was an employee advocate, trying to pull people, move industry out of the Dickensian world that they were, where, with young children, whatever else, climbing chimneys, all sorts of things were going on in those days. But she was their advocate and really talks in here about the need for power with people in place of power over people, which almost brings us all the way back to where we started about, that leader who was prepared to work with people and improve perspectival knowing versus those that worked over people and was driven more from yes, corporate interest, but also not letting go of self-interest in the part. And so her work is absolutely prescient. Yes, she's often regarded as one of the matriarchs of modern management theory, but completely under recognized for and I think that's still in print, believe it or not, and I would encourage people to have a read. And sure, the language is 100 years old, but do bear with it. It's a remarkable resource.
Some great resources there, Richard. Thank you so much. We've come to the end. I just wanted to check, is there anything else you'd like to share before we finish up?
Look, I think that whilst we've got this notion of hope that we know all that we need to know, we've got the technology that is capable of fixing the biggest problems facing humankind right now with regard to the loss of biodiversity, climate change, and poverty, and all of those things that are formulated around the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. Whilst we've got all that, and that we should have hope for that, the only way, there's a power vacuum that's sort of getting in the way. Those with power, those with money are the few that's setting the agenda for the most. And my encouragement for people, wherever you are, and particularly when you're younger, find the hard questions and ask them. If this is the solution, what's the problem? If that's the problem, why is it a problem? And if I did that, would it actually address the essence and add value to the world for the future? Those are the sorts of things. Keep finding those questions and dig into them. As I did when I was young. And sooner or later, someone will go, great question, Hodge. Why don't you create an experiment to answer it? Right? And then you go, wow. And all of these resources, you're then not just reading and infusing, you're actually then building on, and you're owning a piece of the future and carrying it forward. So, and it starts with your capacity to ask hard questions.
Love that. Now, Richard, if people would like to reach out to you, where would be the best place for them to find you?
Yeah. Well, you'll find me on LinkedIn, and perhaps I can put my LinkedIn connection at Richard Hodge, PhD on LinkedIn, or perhaps visit my website, www.drdrrichardhodge.com, and again we'll put that in there, and feel free to drop me an email, richard@drrichardhodge.com, and I'd be only too pleased to have or open a conversation with you.
Thank you so much. It's been such a fabulous interview, and as we go into further seasons, I'm sure we'll get you back as a guest. So appreciate it, Richard. Thank you so much.
Delighted. Thank you, Danette.
Alrighty, what a great conversation. Welcome back, listeners, viewers. That was an awesome one. Danette, did you have any thoughts on the conversation you just had?
Dr. Richard Hodge always blows my mind when I have a conversation with him, and this was no different. I really loved, and for those who are listening, I would encourage you to have a look at the YouTube video, because you'll see behind Richard, he's got dragonflies. He talks about them throughout the conversation, and he uses his body even to explain them, which so is part of who he is. I really loved his advice for people starting out. About, people will sometimes tell you when you're starting out, do this. And he actually gave a much better way of thinking that is through asking some hard questions. And there's a number of really good questions he's shared throughout this podcast. And then basically that builds your knowledge, your experience, because you're then using that to inform how you go about doing things, which then helps you as you move forward think more like a manager. As you get to management, think more like a leader, then a board member, etc. So I loved how these questions can be used at all levels to inform and help us solve those, what people often think of as really impossible questions. If we keep working, we can actually solve them. So I love that he had that really big picture focus. And he spoke about towards the end where they were talking about work done with Indigenous communities. And his advice was, instead of coming in, and I'll read this so I get the order right, directing, reflecting, connecting, and respecting, then actually what we should do is reverse that. So we should start first by respecting, because there's a lot of wisdom in the Indigenous cultures, then connecting, then reflecting, then directing. And I really like that, because that allows that we co-collaborate to create something that actually is, that the community can then put in place, and that is sustainable. So fabulous conversation, and he's just such a genius, man.
Yes, very much so. And I was just going to say, it reminds me, actually, there's a core theme between this, our last episode with Emma Gibbons, and then the episode before with Colin, which is all about connection before anything starts.
Yes.
Which even I was talking about with the public speaking actually before, which is about building that. It's interesting that we don't do this as a standard, because it's come up in every conversation we've just had in the last 3 episodes, is that everything starts at the connection level, and then from there it allows you to build out. Whereas if we try and put that connection at the end, which might be I think 2 brands just smashing together,
yes,
for something, and they haven't connected beforehand, they've just gone, this is a good opportunity, you lose out on a lot of stuff there. So and you sort of you may not even understand the problem.
Yeah, and Jez, what I love about that is there's a lot of science around the connection. So historically, I think we've lived in a world that doesn't really value people. So like it's getting stuff done rather than the people. But we know that high performance, the number one factor is psychological safety, and that requires us to connect. So with good connection, we create trust, which for some people it's like, no, I don't have time to get that. I just need to get this thing done. And it's like, if we're collaborating, actually you don't have time not to create that connection, because with high trust, we see reduction in red tape and bureaucracy, and we move forward together to get stuff done. So I love that you had that insight. I'd never thought of it that way.
It's reminded me actually of something that I think explains some things that are sort of my generation and certainly younger below me. Not to say that I understand the generations below me. I'm almost as confused as everybody in the ages above me. But one thing that is very common now with sort of brands and things that are sort of targeted towards people that are my age is the use of memes. I mean, people know this. Memes work for everybody, but certainly a lot of brands that you wouldn't expect implement memes. This might be news organizations now. This might be fashion brands, what have you. All of them use memes, and you might go, why is that? But I think it's exactly what you're talking about. It's building connection. If you laugh at this, you will probably, like, we are sharing some level of connection here, and then that's going to bring you in to maybe share in this brand. And so that's kind of the thinking there, which is about that connection as well.
Yes. Love that. Oh,
I was just going to say, well, if you're looking at that and you're going, okay, are there more tips to be more adaptable? I did mention at the top, but we do have to talk a little bit about your book, Mum, The Adaptable Leader, 7 Skills to Help You Succeed During Uncertainty. I'd say definitely the times are as uncertain as they've been in a while. Totally. So I think people should go definitely pick that up, because we're definitely, that's the main companion piece that this podcast is based out of.
Yes. And yeah, I wrote that book, Jez, to really give people some practical ways to adapt during lots of uncertainty. And I had a conversation with a friend the other day, and they were saying what they really liked and enjoyed about the book was the stories from real life leaders that then had, this can help you do that even better. So I love to give practical advice, and I know that through feedback that book has definitely hit the mark. I also love that we're doing these podcast series, because they help us to remain relevant around the topics that are in that ACCEPTS model. And ACCEPTS stands, for those that haven't heard, that we need to be authentic, we need to be curious, we need to collaborate, we need to experiment, we need to problem solve, we need to transform, and we need to be sustainable. So we picked 2 of those elements, collaboration and problem solving, for this series. So we will talk on other elements in future series. But really, I wanted to provide people with some other case studies, some other thought leaders who are able to help us think more deeply about the topics of collaboration and problem solving.
Absolutely. So, well, speaking of thinking deeply about problems of collaboration and problem solving, we've got a listener write in. So if people want to write into you, Danette, and ask questions, best place to do that is adapt with Danette@gmail.com, but you can also do it on Spotify, and you can also do it on YouTube. We're pretty active monitoring those places. So if you have a question, feel free to send that in. It may get answered in a future episode. So we highly recommend writing those, and we love to receive them. And today's no different. We've got one from Angela. Hey, Danette. I'm in the later stages of starting my own wellness business, but it will be my first time starting a business. You've been running your business for quite a while from what I remember. What tips would you have for someone starting their first business? Thanks for your insight, Angela.
Congratulations, Angela. How awesome that you're starting your first business. So I'm just going to do a bit of a party dance to start out with. And so I had a conversation earlier this week with someone around business. And one of the things I think that we don't know, or we hope isn't true, but it is true, is that running a business is hard. Like, there'll be times where it's up, there'll be times where it's down. When you first start out, you're usually doing everything, and you'll be really good at some things, and so you'll tend to want to focus on them. But it requires a lot of things. So the faster you can seek help and get others to, who have skills you don't really want to grow, that can be really helpful. I think on the theme of adaptability, and particularly collaboration and problem solving, that if you can collaborate with others, so one of the things that I do is talk to other business owners Sometimes we end up doing joint ventures together. Sometimes we just share our war stories and things that worked for us to move through that. So I really like that. And when I get stuck, what I really love, and I learned this from John Mattone, who we have had on a Magical Learning podcast, and it's in one of the assessments we do with John. And it's about how, when I get into a stressful situation, do I ask myself really good questions so that I don't get stuck in the problem, that I'm actually able to build my leadership maturity and be able to get myself out of that situation fast. And the quality of your questions absolutely will make a huge difference. The other thing is, in any business, you can have the best ideas, but if you haven't tested it on the market, you can find that maybe it's not needed. Your pricing may not be right. And it is really important to have cash. Like, we need to pay bills. We need to keep the electricity. If you've got team members, you need to be able to pay them. So they're also important. And what you start with is not going to be how it ends. So I've found, and we do this, and Jez has definitely experienced this, that we have quarterly planning where we start to switch where we're focusing because the market is changing. So I think the idea of updating what you are doing on a quarterly basis, so having your big vision and knowing why you run this business, but then tweaking it regularly so that you stay up to date with the market trends, can be really important. And the first time it gets hard, don't quit. Just keep moving through and work with others to be able to get to the other side and learn from that. So there's some of my tips, Jez. Very excited for Angela. That's so cool.
Me too. And Angela, please feel free to share any details about that business with us. I don't really have any tips. I don't really run my own business. I do some freelance work. The only thing is that I can say with the freelance work is the initial stuff will start off being a bit rough, but as much as you can, try and dip your toes into areas that you want to be more involved with a wellness thing. That could be, if you're more spiritual, maybe down getting a tarot reader in, or some element like that where you want to bring out a bit more of your own personality. If it's about professional development like this, maybe it's bringing in Danette. Who knows? But
happily come in.
There's there's all these options, and I think if you can sort of try and gear yourself a little bit more towards what you actually want to do, even within that space, I think that always helps a little bit. Like I said in a previous episode, sometimes it can be good to think about it as trying to make money in the easiest way possible with what you've got. And I think if you can make it easier by just making it more fun, then that's always a good option, if you have the option to do that.
Yes. And Jez, your advice there at the end about fun, a lot of people get really serious and they forget why. And the fun is such a critical part, because we work with our brain when we have fun. So make it fun.
Well, thanks for that, Danette. Now, Danette, did you have any final thoughts on today's conversation with Richard and solutions to problematic problems, or just everything that we've been talking about in general?
Look, I really loved and valued this time chatting to Dr. Richard Hodge. I really like that, looking at a situation, particularly when it's complex, etc., as that whole problematic rather than just focusing on that problem. And I loved, we spoke about experimenting in this conversation, that sometimes we won't necessarily have all of the solutions. So part of the way we work out and learn moving forward is to experiment with ideas. Some of them will work, some of them won't, but it gets us closer to a solution that is likely to be sustainable. I love that.
Fantastic. Well, everybody, thank you so much for listening and sharing and enjoying this. If you have been enjoying these conversations, we've also been doing a few one-on-ones with Danette on the Magical Learning feed, so you can go check those out. There have been a few recent ones, but other than that, Danette, do you have any final words for people?
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, our listeners and our viewers. And as always, stay adaptable.